Shabbat Shalom again. I want us to go on a walk for just a moment in our minds through the city of Jerusalem. Whether you've been there just a few times and stayed in some of its most beautiful hotels, or whether you're very intimately familiar with it, I want you to think of Rachov HaDavid HaMelech, Rachov David HaMelech, King David Street, the famous street that separates old city from new. And as you walk down the hill, because it's a very hilly street, and as you walk south, it splits. And one of those splits becomes Derech Beit Lechem, literally the road to Bethlehem. And the other one becomes Emek Rephaim. And Emek Rephaim is also a busy street, though not quite as busy as David HaMelech. But as it turns west and begins to crawl through the city, it becomes residential and historic, and it winds its way through Baka on one side, one neighborhood, and the German colony, the Yoshav HaGermanit, on the other. And while everyone knows that Emek Rephaim is one of the most beautiful streets to walk through in Jerusalem, very few people are aware of the strange biblical allusion contained within its name. Emek Rephaim is quite literally the valley of ghosts, I heard, but more accurately, giants. The valley of giants. Although if you were to look into a Hebrew-English dictionary for the word giant, or if you were to ask an Israeli how to say giant in Hebrew, you would not hear Rephaim. You would hear probably Anak or Anikim. Rephaim is a rare word in the Torah, appearing 5 times or less. But, well, wouldn't you know it, this week just happens to be one of those times that Rephaim appears in our Torah. It is in this week's Parsha. And for those of you who have gotten to know me over the course of the last year, you know that one of these rare words is an irresistible lure to me, a rabbit hole to dive down into and discover myth and folklore and midrash and commentary, which I view as the literary lifeblood of our people, who use their powers of imagination to fill in the blank spaces around Torah for the better part of 2,000 years. So, if you still have your Tanakh next to you, your Plaut Torah commentary, you can turn to page 1171, and if you're at home and are following along in a different Torah commentary, you can turn to Deuteronomy 3, verse 11. That is 1171 in the Plaut and 311 in Devarim, Deuteronomy, if you're at home. And you'll see that it says, only King Og of Bashan was left of the remaining Rephaim. And Rabbi Plaut doesn't even bother to translate the word in the English translation. He just leaves it entirely as it is, though if you turn to the bottom of the page, you'll see in his commentary that this is a folkloric note which pictures Og as the survivor of a race of giants. And then it gives us a brief trail of crumbs to follow into the book of Joshua, where the author continues to mention that Og was the last of the Rephaim. And if you continue reading into 3:12, you will see that the text continues and that it references the bed of Og, a gigantic iron contraption that is probably a euphemism for his sarcophagus, which was, and the Torah says, 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. Don't worry, I won't make you do the math. That is 14 feet tall and 6 feet wide, which implies that whether that was his coffin or his bed, he was not a small man. And so it is this lack of smallness, it is in fact the largeness of his bed, which prompts our journey into a new understanding of what is this word, Rephaim. Because previously, when we saw the word Rephaim, it was in the book of Genesis, in chapter 14, as one of the many tribes which is defeated in the war of the 4 kings against the 5. And that is a story in the book of Genesis from the early days of Abraham, where different Canaanite kings go to war with each other, often identified as a kind of commentary on the pseudo-Assyrian Empire. And the Rephaim are a Canaanite tribe that just loses that war. So at least as far as the book of Genesis is concerned, the first time we saw them, they are just background characters in this Bronze Age battle for dominance over the land of Canaan. They're in competition for natural resources, but they've already been defeated and struck down. But here comes the book of Numbers, and here comes the book of Deuteronomy, and suddenly we re-encounter the Rephaim, or rather, because this is a very important point, we encounter the Amorites, who are led by Og. Here we hear the last of the Rephaim. And in Numbers, we see Og only as king of the Amorites, but here in Deuteronomy, which is, as Rabbi McCarroll taught us, a repetition of what has happened before, he is both king of the Amorites and the last of the Rephaim. And so from this context, this transformational context, we now are beginning to see that the Rephaim is being transformed away from just being one more Canaanite tribe. It's not saying, here is the Amorites who were led by the last of the insert-ites here. The author of Deuteronomy, the people who are interpreting Deuteronomy, clearly understand that the Rephaim means something different now. And as we'll see through the power of Midrash, what they imply that to mean is superhumanly large, superhumanly strong, giant figures. In Numbers 21:33, which is part of Parshat Chukat, which we read a few weeks ago, we read about the battle with King Og. And it goes, King Og of Bashan with all of his people came out to Edrei to battle them in war, and they defeated him, Og and his sons, and all of his people, until nothing was left of them, and they took possession of their country. And that's not really much of a battle account. It's not really interesting. It's not particularly detailed. It doesn't particularly bring anything to the mind. It's just a listing. There was a battle. Who won it? The Israelites. And so in their true fashion, the rabbis in the Talmud, in Brachot 54b, they decide to fill in some of the details. And very quickly they make it clear, this is not an ordinary battle. When it was time to go to war against Israel, Og asked, how large is the camp of Israel? And he was told that it was 3 parasangs long, which is approximately 10 miles. And he nodded, and he said he would go and he would uproot a nearby mountain, and that he would hurl it at the Israelites and crush them all to death. And so he went, and he grabbed a mountain that was exactly 3 parasangs long, and he hoisted it up over his head. But at that very moment, the Holy One, blessed be God, sent ants, or maybe grasshoppers. The translation and the word is unclear. And they bore tiny little holes in the mountain so that it collapsed and fell about his head. And Og tried very hard to throw the mountain away, but he could not. And while he was struggling, Moses, who, the Talmud then inserts and tells us, was 10 cubits tall, around 15 feet, took an axe that was also 10 cubits tall, 15 feet, and jumped as tall as the axe, which is again 15 feet, and he struck Og in his ankle. And Og died. Rabbi David Kasher of Los Angeles points out, this is quite strange, isn't it? Not only is Og a super strong giant capable of plucking mountains from their root and holding them above his head, but now Moses is a superhuman giant as well? And where did those ants come from? Well, if you thought that that was the most fantastical thing I was going to show you this morning, we haven't started yet. So to understand our next text, we need to go back to that Parshat Chukat element that I was talking about, which is, for those of you who really want to see it, is part of Numbers 21, where Moses is told regarding Og, Do not fear him. Do not fear Og. I will deliver him and his people into your hands. And our rabbis, they rightfully point out to us that this is a very strange statement for the Torah to be making. Moses has already defeated the greatest empire in the world. He's fought against kings, he's defeated desert raiders, he's had insurrections against him. Moses is capable of handling everything and has defeated many Canaanite kings already. So why would Moses need to be reassured by God not to be afraid of Og? Why is there a special level of fear regarding Og that God needs to intervene and say, Moses, do not be afraid? And the Midrash responds by saying, none was mightier than Og. He was the strongest who had ever stood in the world. He was the last of the Rephaim. Here's that word again, implying this powerful giant. But how does the Midrash supplement that? How do we get there? How did we even have this idea from nowhere that this never before mentioned character is somehow meant to be the single most physically powerful person in the world? And so the Midrash again returns to that story of Genesis, the 4 kings against the 5, which I'll remind you is the only other time in the Torah that we've seen this word previously, and recalls that the Rephaim were destroyed by an invasion from afar in that 4 kings against the 5 war. And it says in Genesis, they struck the Rephaim. And so in the minds of our rabbis then, Og is the last of the Rephaim from that battle, which took place nearly 700 years previously. So now Og is from the days of Abraham. Og becomes mythological. Og becomes transformed because he's not just a king in the Amorites. He is a giant from the days of Abraham Avinu. So the Midrash then cleverly describes him as akin to the pit of an olive which survives the olive press. That last scrappy, hard bit that no matter how hard you push it, you just can't crush down. And they're not done, because the question has still not been answered. Sure, he's a giant from the days of Avraham Avinu, the last of his kind, an impossible-to-kill enemy who can lift mountains above his head, but that's not enough in the minds of the rabbis, at least, to intimidate Moshe Rabbeinu, to intimidate Moses. Moses is unimpressed by physical strength. And it doesn't matter if you have all of the physical might in the world, and it doesn't matter if you have the mightiest army in the world, because Moses has God on his side. So clearly, there must be something else, something that fits that rabbinic worldview, where physical strength is nothing and spiritual strength is everything, in order to make us afraid of Og. And so the Midrash very cleverly once again returns to Genesis and says, well, during that 4 kings against the 5 war, the Torah tells us that a survivor came and brought news to Avram that his nephew Lot had been kidnapped and needed to be rescued. And who is this survivor then? Why, the survivor could only be the survivor of the Rephaim. He could only be that last giant, and so he has to be Og. And this, according to Rashi, our great commentator, is the reason why Moses is terrified. It's not because Og is strong or huge or long-lived or has a mighty army, but because 700 years ago, he performed an act of goodness. He performed an act of chesed, of kindness for the Jewish people. And therefore, Og has zechut. Og has merit earned from helping Avraham himself. And so while no physical force, no physical might could ever intimidate Moses, the idea of his opponent being righteous, or the idea of his opponent carrying a righteous deed, stops him in his tracks. He has to stop and consider that if the people of Israel essentially owe Og a favor, if we owe him back a debt from this century-old kindness, if we go to war with him, whose side is God going to be on? And in the Talmud, in Tractate Nida especially, it states this explicitly, that Moses is afraid that Og has special merit. And he's in fact worried that he's not going to war with Og. He would be going to war with the merit of Avraham Avinu himself. He would be essentially waging war against Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. He would be waging war against God because God may be on Og's side. And that terrifies Moses, and that is why God has to say to Moses, do not be afraid. I am with you. Because Moses truly considers for a moment that he might not be in the right. Moses truly considers, according to our Talmud, that he might be on the wrong side of history. Rabbi Yochanan says, yes, all that's great and all. But I have a new idea. You know when you said that Og was a survivor? Well, I don't read that as a survivor of the battle of the 4 kings against the 5. I read that as a survivor of the flood. I believe that Og survived Noah's flood. And he quotes Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which says, everyone perished in the flood, but Noah and Og, king of Bashan, who sat on a ladder that was next to the ark, and he swore to Noah and his sons that he would serve them forever. So what did Noah do? Well, he drilled a hole in the ark, and he stuck out food from it every day for Og to eat from. And thus Og also survived. Wow. That last one's a lot harder to parse into that greater narrative, I will not lie, but I just want to take the moment to note the incredible length that our ancestors went to in order to flesh out the story of these characters, to make it so that every single word inside of Torah, no matter how minor, whether it's the description of a bed, or seemingly direct, naming a tribe, or simple, the conversation that God has with someone who's about to go into war, actually needs to contain a world inside of it. It contains endless depths and the opportunity for learning, the opportunity for imagination, the opportunity for creativity. The rabbis find the ability to apply their morality into Torah inside of moments that are so small, and they manage to do so inside of a text that they refuse to change. And yet they find a way to find ever new meaning, morality, and mystery at every moment. And I want to stress that point as I close this morning. I want to move away from the fantastical. I want to move away from the midrashic and really stress what incredible work the rabbis managed to do here. They managed to take this single phrase in our Torah, the last of the Rephaim, which could mean any number of things, but almost all of them are completely mundane. And instead, they connect it with an internal logic that is so strong that it allows them to bind Devarim, one end of the Torah, to Bereshit, Genesis, the other end of the Torah. And from there, they can draft stories and myths into the blank spaces of the page, enrich the narrative so that every single verse has a new layer of meaning, and then, on top of that, they manage to imbue humanity into those characters so that they can ask vital moral questions from every single person who reads that text. They manage to see an enemy who exists for one line before he is destroyed as a rich person with a full history who once did acts of kindness and goodness for others, and allow him to ask a question of Moses, a genuine question that all human beings must ask themselves throughout our lives. Am I sure that I am acting morally right? Am I sure that I am on the right side of history? from one phrase, last of the Rephaim. And this finding of all of that in one single line of a page, this is the power of Talmud Torah. This is the power of Torah study. This is what it means when our rabbis wrote to us and taught us that Talmud Torah keneged kulam, that the study of Torah is equal to the other great acts of chesed and kindness and merit, because once you see that there is no place, not a single word of Torah that cannot lead you to an ethical, sacred way of living, then you realize that all of the other things will simply fall into place. And so, to quote my great teacher, Rabbi Yafa Epstein, how amazing is the Torah? And how amazing is the study of it, which leads us to richer lives. And so as we enter into this sacred time of year, which is marked by the entry into this final book of Torah, may all of us find the zechut, the merit, to fill our minds and our souls and our lives with new enriched words of our traditions, from the smallest phrases to the most giant of takeaways.